Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on Facebook Live. We are coming to you from the ACFE headquarters in Austin, Texas. My name is Mandy Moody. I am the content manager here, and I am joined today by John Warren, our VP and General Counsel.
Hello.
And Andi McNeal, the Director of Research here at the ACFE.
Hi, everyone.
And today we're going to be digging into the latest report to the nations. This is actually the 10th edition of the report, and John has been around long enough to have seen all of those editions, right, John?
That is correct. That is right.
And actually, we were just talking about one of the very first reports and how it all came together, and there's a story they pass around here about note cards and paper and pen. I mean, I don't know if anyone still remembers what that is, but paper and pen. What was it like
Just
in the beginning?
Just a little less technically savvy back then. It was all done on paper. We had boxes of survey forms, like 6 pages long, and we spent maybe a year reordering and restacking and organizing note cards, all to design the fraud tree, which is sort of the structural basis of the report now. So a little more technically savvy now. We do it by electronic means and have databases and
Sometimes we break out note cards for fun.
Sometimes we break out note cards just for, old time's sake. But yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and dig in. So I want to start with controls. That's something that regularly comes up for, I know, a lot of our members. And just to give you a brief overview, this year we had almost 3,000 cases from 125 countries. And of that...
Biggest report ever.
Yeah.
Biggest report ever. Wow. So 18 controls were analyzed.
Right.
Which sounds like a lot, but I imagine they're all equally important. What did the findings this year tell us about those anti-fraud controls and how they're working?
Right, so we asked our survey respondents to give us a little bit of information about the controls that the victim organizations had in place when the fraud happened. Keeping in mind that all of the organizations we studied had a fraud occur, we found it really interesting to kind of look at what the organizations that were victimized were already doing to prevent fraud, to detect fraud, and then what the profiles were at organizations that had controls versus those that didn't. And what we found is that across the board, anti-fraud controls matter. They make a difference. All 18 controls that we looked at, when we compared organizations that had them against organizations that didn't, every single one of them was correlated with the lower fraud loss and with quicker detection. So basically that means they were working. If the organizations didn't have them, they lost more money, they took longer to detect the fraud. So they matter. Interestingly, though, a couple of the controls that we looked at that had the greatest effectiveness were also the ones that aren't as common. So the two that really jumped out to me were proactive data analysis and monitoring. So companies that are really digging into their data and trying to identify red flags of fraud real time. And then surprise audits, the companies that are not just having the routine audits, they're actually sending people in either unannounced or having them do new procedures or testing new areas or new ways. Both of those controls were among the top of the list when it comes to reduced losses and quicker detection, but only 37% of the organizations in our study actually had those controls in place. So there's room for improvement, and that's a really good area for people to take this information to their management or to their clients and say, hey, these are areas where if you're not already doing them, you might really look into adding them to your program. On the flip side, external audits, one of the most common controls we had, 80% of the organizations in our study used external audits, but they're not all that effective in terms of reducing fraud losses and detecting fraud. They're not designed to do that. I think, unfortunately, there's still a lot of people that think that that's one of the primary objectives of external audits, and that does overlap some, but for organizations that are really relying on external audits to be their primary control mechanism to detect fraud, they're going to have higher fraud losses. It's going to take longer to uncover the fraud.
And that's something you and I were just talking about. Recently we got, I think it was in our online community, and we got a question in about it, what is the auditor's responsibility to find fraud? And your response to them was,
that there's a lot of confusion out there. People still think auditors are going in looking for fraud, and while they have to consider fraud as part of their audit, that's not their main goal. And so it's really, have the audits. They serve an important purpose, but don't rely on them as the way to find fraud in your company.
Yeah, we're not saying don't do audits.
Yeah, no, they have an important purpose.
They're useful,
and
just not
they
effective.
did, they did detect 4% of the cases in our study, so it's not nothing. But they're going to detect the bigger frauds. They're going to detect the financial statement frauds, less on the employee embezzlement and asset misappropriation side. So just put them in context with your entire anti-fraud program.
Yeah. Also worth noting, 30% of frauds, when we asked what led the fraud to occur, 30% said lack of internal controls was the primary reason the fraud occurred in the first place.
And I think another almost
20%
had an override of internal controls. So we're looking at 50%
Some
of
sort
the
of
cases.
control failure in 50% of cases.
So room for improvement, absolutely. And some really good information for people to take to, like I said, their management, their clients, and say, we've got data that shows these controls work, they're really important, and they're worth the investment.
Yeah.
So, John, you recently said in one of our meetings, when we were talking about findings and things that stuck out to us, and you even wrote it in the report, people are learning from experience how to steal from their employers.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. So when we do the report, one of the things we really focus on is trying to understand the characteristics of the perpetrators. We look at a lot of factors, like how long have they worked for the company being one of them, but also what position were they in, what department did they work in, what was their age, what was their gender, a whole bunch of demographic factors to see if we can kind of understand what leads somebody to commit fraud or what might make somebody more effective at it. And it turns out that tenure is one of the key predictors in how good somebody will be at committing fraud. They're not necessarily more likely to commit it, but when they do it, they're better at it. So there is kind of a dividing line right around 5 years. If you have worked for a company 5 years or less, you know, everybody in that batch, and then there's a batch of everybody who's worked 6 years or more. The people who've worked there 6 years or more, the median loss in their frauds is double the loss of the less experienced people, right? So they're stealing twice as much. It's $200,000 per case as opposed to $100,000 per scheme for the less experienced. And so the question then is why? Why does that happen, right? So we thought about a number of possible reasons, and the most obvious seemed to be, well, if you've been there a long time, maybe you're getting promoted, right? Because we know from experience, the higher you go on the org chart, the more money you're going to steal. That's kind of the overriding driving factor. So we looked at that and we said, well, okay, let's just compare executives with shorter tenure to executives with longer tenure, and then do the same thing for managers and the same thing for employees. And in every level of responsibility, the more experienced people still stole significantly more. So what that tells us is that tenure is kind of its own independent driver for fraud effectiveness. And a couple reasons for that, we think. One is institutional knowledge. If you've been in an organization for a long time, you understand how things really work. Like we all have, right, our actual programs and procedures, and then we know how things really get done, right? And the longer you're there, the more you understand how the gears really turn. And so you know where the holes are gonna be. The second thing, which is I think maybe even more important, is the concept of trust. Frauds are crimes of trust. When you've been somewhere for a long time, when you've done a good job, when you've established yourself, you tend to engender a certain amount of trust from those who work with you. And when you boil controls down to their sort of essence, it's you need independent verification, you need like two people looking at everything. Somebody's got to be reviewing what you do, right? And when you have somebody who's trusted, has a reputation for doing a good job, maybe we're more likely to sign off on something they do without a real thorough review, or maybe we're not as likely to look closely at their transactions. And part of that happens because, again, it's important to remember the people who commit occupational fraud, up until the moment they do it, are typical employees, often very good employees.
They look like everybody else.
They look like everybody else. That's exactly right. So you can't see one coming, really. And so I think the takeaway is it's really important to make sure your controls are applied uniformly across every position and every person. And we're not doing that because we don't trust the person. We're doing that because we don't know if there's going to come a point in a time when we can no longer trust that person. There's just no way to predict who's going to commit fraud. The long-term employees are, again, they're more effective at it, and these may be people who you've worked with, you've had dinner with their family, you know them well, it doesn't matter.
They are your family?
They are your family, that's very common. And one of the most common things you hear at the end of these frauds is, I can't believe it was him, or I can't believe it was her. I never thought that would be the person. And so you just need to keep that in mind, that no matter how much you trust somebody, no matter how great you think they are, maintain your systems and processes and controls, and that's the most important way to protect yourself. That's what our data indicates anyway.
Yeah. So I want to talk about now red flags.
Yeah.
So something different you guys did this year is you incorporated a lot more infographics into the report, and we've gotten a lot of compliments on them because it takes it out from just the text on a paper and really lets it tell a story. And one of the infographics this year were the red flags of fraud and what those are and how those show up. And, you know, we could look at many cases and point out, okay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, and that's in hindsight. And one case I read recently was about this worker at the Arkansas Lottery who went in and finagled some things internally so that he would win. And one of the reporters who covered this story said he exhibited 4 out of the 5 red flags that are highlighted in this report. And, you know, those are living beyond your means, not happy with pay. Tell me about those red flags, and tell me how they came about and really how companies can and should use them even before the fraud happens. Right.
And this is really interesting, and the before the fraud happens is key, because that's what we're really trying to get at here. And we've been studying these for years, and you know, what you said about the infographics, I think, is right, because I don't think we've always done a good job of conveying how interesting this data is, right? We had these giant charts. We think it's fascinating, and no one else can. We're fraud nerds. But the thing to remember is fraud. We tend to treat it, I think people in the industry tend to treat it as an accounting issue, and it's really a behavioral issue, right? You can have 10 people in your accounting department, and they all have access to the same records, the same systems. They might have similar financial profiles. One of them steals and 9 don't. And why is that? There's a reason for that, and we wanted to kind of understand better what that reason might be. So we knew from just past experience and anecdotally that when you read these cases, you tend to see over and over again the same sorts of things. This person was living a lavish lifestyle, or they were experiencing financial problems or whatever. So back in 2008, we started looking at this, and we did some review of the research and literature, and we identified 17 common red flags that tend to show up in occupational fraud cases. And we just asked our respondents, in the case you looked at, which, if any of these flags showed up or was noticed by someone before the fraud was caught. And the before the fraud was caught is important because, again, we're trying to see, were there clues that somebody could have identified if they would have known what to look for. So in the current study, 85% of the cases, there was at least 1 red flag exhibited before the fraud. In 50%, there were 2. So multiple flags, it's pretty common. There are clues out there, is what we're learning. The real thing to keep in mind is there are 6 that tend to show up every time we do this. There is living beyond means is number 1, and that is if you've got a file clerk, who's driving a Ferrari, that's living beyond means, right? Might want to ask him about that. Where did that come from? Financial difficulties. If you got somebody who's struggling to make ends meet, maybe a spouse lost a job, medical bills, whatever, that's commonly associated with these schemes. Too close of an association with a vendor, somebody's going out, taking trips, things that just seem sketchy. Excessive control issues. They won't let anybody see what they're working on. They hoard their work and the reason they're doing that is they don't want anybody to see the real numbers they're dealing with because they're covering up their fraud. And then divorce and family problems is probably pretty closely tied to financial issues. I mean, we separate it out, but usually that means somebody's having financial pressure. And then the sixth is what we call a wheeler-dealer attitude, which somebody's just kind of generally perceived to be unscrupulous, maybe a little slimy.
A little shady, right?
Those 6 have been the top 6 in every study we've done since 2008. And this is what's really cool. Again, this is a big fraud nerd alert, but we take these all 17 controls and we plot them, right? We say, okay, 40% living beyond means, 30% financial difficulties, and you develop this curve, right? When you apply that curve over different years, you get the same distribution every time. So in each study, we're dealing with an entirely different set of frauds committed by an entirely different set of people, often in different countries, in different regions, in different companies, and yet you're seeing the same distribution of red flags show up every time. It's happened so often that we feel pretty confident that this is just kind of what fraud looks like behaviorally. So about 40% of the time, you're going to have somebody living beyond their means, 30% financial difficulties, and so forth. There's a lot of information in the report you can look at. We've kind of compiled it this year. In the past, you kind of had to pick it from different charts, but we've put it all together in an infographic this year to make it easier to understand. But I think the takeaway is we should be using this in practice more than we are. And it's a little delicate because you can't go, every time somebody gets divorced, you can't accuse them of committing fraud, right? Somebody's having financial difficulties. That doesn't mean they're committing fraud. These aren't hard and fast indicators, but what they are pieces of a picture, right? So if you're already seeing weird numbers and you've got somebody who maybe meets these profile points, maybe you look a little more closely at their work. The other side of it is there's a school of thought when you talk about the fraud triangle. For those who are watching who are familiar with the fraud triangle, the reason frauds typically begin is because somebody's got a financial pressure. I'm making a triangle here. That's the top of the triangle. And they have some sort of financial pressure that they need to resolve, and that's why they commit fraud, right? There's a school of thought that says that just allowing someone to relieve that pressure by talking about it, even if you don't necessarily solve it, can lessen the likelihood that they'll engage in the fraudulent conduct. So even on a preventative side, things as simple as like encouraging people to come talk to you when they've got, financial problems or something.
Or family problems.
Or family problems or whatever.
Therapist, but
exactly.
Open door policies.
Open door policies, exactly. That, just kind of a situation where they feel less like they have to do this because they've got no other way to get out of the problem they're in. So very interesting stuff. Hopefully people take a look at it and make some use out of that.
I think the other really interesting thing that John gets to play with the red flags data, and he always comes up with some really interesting findings. But one of the things that I really appreciate about the way it was presented this year is we even broke out a couple sort of sub analyses where we break down the red flags by position and we break them down by gender, because we're seeing that people at different authority levels within an organization actually display different red flags based on, if they're a manager or an executive. That person's pressures are going to look different than somebody that's a rank and file employee. And we actually even find that there's a slightly different red flag profile based on gender, right? Yeah. The red flags that we see in the male perpetrators are different than what we see in the females. And I think that's really interesting too. Yeah. It's not just a blanket, right? You want to look at the whole picture when you're looking at the risk profile. It's not just like, oh, this one person drives a car and I don't know where they got it, or this one person's going through a divorce. We want to make sure that you're thinking through all of the different pieces of that risk profile.
And you're kind of seeing some of this being done already in some of the high-tech side of investigations where people are doing work with unstructured text, doing fraud triangle analytics or whatever they may call it, like emotional analytics or whatever, but looking for indicators in emails and things that indicate these pressure points. These are it's kind of the same idea, but I think it's a little maybe more thorough look at this in terms of like how frequently these different sorts of clues are showing up in these fraud cases.
Oh, absolutely. I know that I've had conversations with people where they've talked about these red flags and this data sort of being informative to their sentiment analysis and their textual analytics initiatives, and saying, this really helps us fine tune what types of things are we looking for. So.
And just one last thing, we talked before about you can't always recognize a fraudster. A fraudster doesn't really look like a fraudster. The 6 most common flags that I mentioned before, number 6 was wheeler dealer, which is that's the person who seems a little slimy. That's the one you could have maybe identified. You just knew they were shady, but they were about 15% of cases. There are other things like living beyond means, financial difficulties that are much more common. So the I knew he was shady is, while it's in the top 6, it's lower on that spectrum. Right. It's not as common as other things. So it really does underscore that you can't always see them coming.
Right.
A question from somebody watching. Thank you very much for submitting a question. How can we balance loyalty and suspicion for employees who have been working more than 6 years?
That's tough, right?
Yeah. But you decided to answer it.
Yeah. Well, I suspect everybody. So,
we've all been here more than 6 years at this point, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, we're all. No, I don't think it's a question of suspicion. I think that's the point. Is that you don't want to approach your controls from a perspective of, we are doing this because we think you're cheating us, or we're doing this because we think you're dishonest, or whatever that case may be. I think the important thing to remember is when we're implementing controls and processes, we're doing that dispassionately, right? We do it because it's a process. It's not targeted at Mandy or at Andy. That's the way we do things. Right. And as long as we adhere to, this is the way we do it in all cases without exception, it doesn't feel like it becomes a loyalty issue or an accusation issue. It's just, that's the way things get done.
Right, the concept of trust but verify. Yeah. That's really the underscore for controls in general, right?
Yeah.
We don't want people to feel like you are suspicious all the time and that everybody's under watch all the time.
Yeah.
You still have to get your job done too. You don't want to set up too many roadblocks to where things aren't moving. But it's that, if you build it into your policies and your procedures, and you have a general culture that encourages, open door discussions and transparency and the separation of duties and things like that, it has to sort of be baked in, right? So that it doesn't end up looking like you're singling out any single person. It's certainly not because they've been there for 6 years or longer.
And it can't even look like you're you suspect your entire workforce, right? You don't want a situation where employees feel like the management doesn't trust us, or we're not a part of a team. You really, we talk, another big part of the anti-fraud world and is the idea of tone at the top.
Right.
And you need not just an ethical tone at the top, but you need a tone that runs through your organization that everybody feels like they're pulling in the same direction, and we're kind of all in this together. And when you get people who are resentful of management, who feel like they're being mistreated, who feel like they're being watched too closely, that can actually have the opposite effect and make them more likely to commit fraud. So it is that balance of, we're not doing this because we don't trust you, we're doing this because this is the way we do it, because this is prudent and it's effective.
And I think to really make that point, that's the importance of anti-fraud education for your employees, right? If everyone comes in and learns when they get there, and then that message is repeated throughout, like, fraud is bad, fraud hurts all of us, we're all in this together. We need to make sure that we're protecting the company as a whole, and it's not just your job or my job to protect the company. We're all doing it because we all want to keep our jobs and we want to keep the company growing. Then I think people might be less likely to feel like, oh, they're overburdening me with, scrutiny.
Right, that's absolutely true. Having said that, we do suspect Mandy.
So let's move on to the other side, hotlines, and let's talk about, tips coming in. I've covered a few sessions over the past 2 years about how do I build a hotline, but then not stop it there. How do I make sure it's effective and it's even working? I think one of the things that people think is, if I build it, oh, we're done. It's there, but you gotta grow it, right?
Well, and even worse than that is when people are like, we don't have any calls coming in, so we don't have fraud.
Yeah.
You're right.
That's actually the opposite. That's really not a good sign.
That's not a good sign at all.
No, you don't want to have no calls coming into your hotline. That actually means it's pretty ineffective.
So, Andi, tell us more about what the data told us about tips and hotlines.
Absolutely. So since we started tracking detection data on how the frauds that we're looking at were detected, every single study tips come out at the top, and not just at the top, but by far at the top.
Number one.
Yeah. Whatever comes in second is dwarfed by tips. It's 40% more or less year over year. And that's, like John said, we look at different cases every study. We have thousands of cases, and even still, with those differences, we're still getting about 40% of them come in by tips, which is just fascinating in its own right. But it tells us that the importance of tips cannot be underestimated. If you're a company and you're being proactive about wanting to identify fraud and address your fraud risk, you have to be fostering a culture and including mechanisms for people to report their suspicions, even if that means you're going to have to deal with a bunch of HR issues and people that are disgruntled, complaining. Those are
Which
actually
you
will, but that's that's the byproduct of being serious about detecting fraud.
Yeah.
So 40% of cases come in by tips. Interestingly, in our data, 53% of those tips were from employees, but a third of them were actually from outside parties. So vendors, customers, other third parties, they're bringing tips to the table too. And I think there's a huge lesson there. A lot of, we built the hotline, now we're done. It has to be publicized, and it actually has to be publicized externally as well.
Yeah.
People need
everyone
to everyone you deal with.
Customers, vendors.
Everyone you deal with as far as running a business. So whether it's on your website or providing, and I think some companies on customer receipts even include information about if you have suspicions, here's how to contact us. So there's a lot of ways to do it, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that it's not just in your employees that need to know how to report concerns. We also found 14% of the cases were reported by an anonymous party. And so I think it's really important wherever it's legally allowable to enable
anonymous reporting.
Exactly, enable people to stay anonymous or to provide confidential information. There's a lot of reasons that might be necessary. But if you want to be serious about detecting fraud, that's something that has to be considered.
Yeah.
It may be inconvenient, it may be hard to follow up, but it's still, you could miss out on 15% of your frauds if you're. The good news in our study, 63% of the organizations had hotlines. We've actually seen that number go up a little bit over the years. So I think companies are getting the message. This is really important. It's really one of the foundational pieces of an anti-fraud program. And for those companies that do have hotlines in place, we found that they're catching frauds faster, that they're having smaller fraud losses. Yes. So it's paying off as well. It's definitely a worthwhile investment. When a company doesn't have a hotline in place, people still report. There are other ways to report. One of the things we found out is that when a tip doesn't come through a hotline, it's most likely to go to the whistleblower's direct supervisor or an executive. So I think that means it's really important for people in management positions to know what to do with tips if they get them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? You want to make sure that your staff is aware of, hey, somebody might bring a concern to you, and here's what you do with that concern. Because you don't want to have a situation where somebody brought a tip to a manager and the manager sat on it.
That's so counterproductive. And that applies to hotlines too, that to Andi's point, like you can't just have it, you have to follow up on it, and you have to show employees you're following up on it. It's a hard thing for a person to come forward and provide information about a coworker, maybe somebody they know, maybe somebody they like, that could get that person in serious trouble. I mean, people take this seriously. They don't do it lightly, and there can be genuine fears about being retaliated against. And so in order to make them feel comfortable making that decision, you have to show them that you're going to be serious about it and follow up. If somebody makes a complaint about something legitimate and nothing gets done, trust me, everybody else who knows about that same incident is going to be much less likely to report because they just saw it just fell on deaf ears. And so it undermines the whole effectiveness of your reporting program.
Exactly.
Someone just asked, how do we encourage people to report better tips? You mentioned before, and they said we mostly get trivial ones,
Right.
which,
And
you know, is part of
It's going to happen, right? And if you're mostly getting trivial tips, that may mean that you're doing a good job in other areas. And it may also mean that you've got work to do in terms of training your employees about what's reportable, what to do with those trivial concerns, and what it should be coming through more formal mechanisms. If you're getting a lot of trivial reports in a certain area, it may be time to have a talk with managers in that area about, hey, here's some stuff that we're hearing is going on. It's not really falling under what we consider the most important hotline type tips, but it needs to be addressed. So there can be some room for communication there.
Yeah, if this, then this.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then, also just making sure your employees know what types of tips you're looking for. You don't want them to feel shut down, but it's a hard balance. Absolutely.
Yeah. And you're never going to get, to some extent, it's cost of doing business. You're just going to have a certain number of people who are going to call and complain that someone else ate their yogurt out of the lunchroom or something.
Exactly.
And you can't get rid of that totally. But I think Andy's point about education is key, not just for trying to get people to stay away from the trivial tips, but also because a lot of people genuinely don't really know what fraud is, right?
Yeah.
They may see a behavior and not be sure that it's impermissible. They may think, well, that's just how business gets done, or that's how we do things here. So really important to let people know kind of your parameter. This is what we tolerate, this is what we don't, this is what if you see, you should report. This is why you should report it. It hurts us all, it hurts the business, it impacts raises, it impacts jobs, and just educate your people so they know who to come to, they know what's going to happen when they come to you. They know they can do it anonymously, assuming it's legal, so they don't have to, if they're afraid of retaliation, that's not an issue. And then they see you follow up, and they know that the company does something about it, and that goes to your tone at the top again. It shows them there's a commitment.
Well, and along the lines with the tone at the top, if you're getting a lot of trivial tips in a certain area, that may be an indicator of the overall tone in that area.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
If you've got a bunch of disgruntled people that are centered in one particular area, it may not mean that fraud's occurring, but it may mean that the tone is such that fraud could occur more likely in that area, that your fraud risk is higher there. So they may be trivial individually, but it's certainly something that you can watch for a cultural perspective as well.
Yep.
Someone also asked, and this is a little bit of veer from hotlines, but I'm interested in capability, another element of fraud. Did you spot any learning points in the report about capability or someone's?
So that's from I want to say it's the fraud diamond.
The fraud diamond,
Yeah,
that's
the
right.
fourth element where they break out a couple of the ones that are in the triangle.
We didn't specifically test for it, but we did look at a couple of things in terms of position, which the higher up somebody is on the org chart, the more they steal, and that probably speaks in some respect to capability. It may have more to do with access and ability to override controls, but you would hope at least that the people who have risen in your organization are maybe, some of your better employees, and so have stronger capabilities. People with higher education levels also committed larger frauds, which may go to their sort of technical ability or their capacity. And then again, the data we talked about tenure. You've been there longer, you've developed skills that are applicable to your job in your company, and I think that speaks to capability in some respect.
What about segregation of duties?
Well, one of the red flags that we look at, it's kind of related to segregation of duties, but control issues are an unwillingness to share duties. And that was in 20% of the cases we looked at. To me, that speaks a little bit to that segregation of duties and potentially the capability as well. If somebody's able to keep a closed door on what they're doing, not share and not shed light, then that certainly factors into it.
Yep.
So something we found interesting, and we actually put this in our press release, is one of the highlights of the report, and something we shined a little spotlight on, was the criminal fraud referrals that are declining.
Right.
So over the past 10 years, the percentage of frauds referred to law enforcement has declined by about 16%.
Yes.
So what do you think that tells us?
Well, that's a good question. So one of the things, just for those who don't know, one of the things we do in the report is we try to get a holistic view of how a fraud affects an organization, sort of from beginning to end. So we look at who the perpetrator was, what were the characteristics of the victim, how was it caught, all these things. But we also look at what did the victim do afterwards, because we want other companies to be able to learn from the experiences of those who've gone through this before. And so we always ask, did you refer this to law enforcement? As you said, it's gone down. In 2008, just about 70%, 69% of organizations were reporting their frauds to law enforcement authorities, trying to prosecute the offenders. Over time, there's just been kind of a gradual decrease to where it's now, I want to say 58%. And we don't know why, right? We looked at a couple of explanations. Our first thought was, well, maybe they're turning to civil suits instead. Maybe they're trying to go to civil courts and suing for damages and recovering that way. But those rates have maintained, they've been pretty consistent, over the same time period. We also, in our survey, when somebody says that the victim did not report the fraud to law enforcement, we ask them what the reason was for that, and the typical answers would be they're afraid of bad publicity. Mm-hmm. They disciplined the person internally and they considered that to be sufficient. They had reached private settlement, or they viewed it as being too costly. Those would be the four most common. So we thought, well, maybe those are going up, right? Maybe there's been some sort of shift in the decision-making process for organizations, but that's remained constant too. So there's nothing in our data that really says why this trend has declined, but we felt like it's really worth highlighting because it's a really very potentially harmful trend. And the reason is, a couple of reasons, but one is if a person commits a fraud at company A and company A fires them but doesn't take any legal action against them, that person's going to go to work for company B. And company B may do all their due diligence and may do a criminal background check on the person, and they're not going to find anything, and they're going to have no idea they are hiring somebody.
And end up being company A.
And they're going to end up being
another company.
And in another part of our report, we talk about most occupational fraudsters are first-time offenders, and that is absolutely true. But the number of those who are repeat offenders is probably higher than we know, simply because so many never get referred. So there is a subcategory, and my guess would be it's still under 10%, but there is this category of like predatory fraudsters who just sort of hop from company to company to company, committing these crimes. And so that can be really harmful, but it can also be harmful to your own workforce if you catch somebody committing fraud and you don't punish them. And on the other side of that, it can have a real preventative effect if they see that person getting perp walked out of the office, or they understand that person ended up getting prosecuted and getting convicted of a felony or having to pay significant fines or whatever. So it can be valuable, I think, as a fraud deterrence tool to prosecute these people when you have the case.
Andi? Okay. So this is another question from everybody out there, one person out there. Is fraud more likely in financial institution organizations?
So the greatest number of cases in our study occurred at banks and financial institutions, but we tried to be very, very clear that does not necessarily mean more fraud occurs in that industry. We actually think that may be more of a byproduct of where our members are, what organizations are employing CFEs. And we see that a lot of banks are very proactive in hiring CFEs and having them on staff. And those are the people that are responding to our surveys, that are getting certified through us, and that are part of our membership. So we try to make it very clear that we're not saying, hey, you guys in the banking and financial services industry, you guys are at the most risk.
Right.
We do know that the risk profiles in banks and financial services organizations is slightly different than in other organizations. But it should not be read to mean that they are more likely to experience occupational fraud.
But as with all of there is a significant risk. And obviously
Absolutely.
when you're in an institution that deals with huge amounts of money, you're always going to be at risk.
When your employees are literally touching cash all day long, there's a risk there.
Right.
So I want to close this out with something that comes up every year. We always meet to talk about, okay, tell us what's going on. How do we market this? What are we going to say? And you guys always say, a lot of these trends stay the same, but there's significance in that consistency.
Absolutely.
If you follow that, there's significance in the consistency of it. So what do you mean by that? And what does that consistency say?
This is where we really nerd out every 2
Yeah,
years,
yeah.
right? We get the data in and we have this whole new set. We've kind of talked about it a little bit already, right? This whole new set of a few thousand fraud cases, and we're diving in and we're running the numbers and we're looking at trends, and we're like, oh, this looks just like the last 4 studies we've done, which might sound like it could be disappointing, but the nerd in me kind of loves it, because I'm like, we're onto something.
Right.
We're actually onto something here. I'm going to bang on the table because I mean it. We're onto the fact that, okay, we know that roughly 10% of occupational frauds involve financial statement fraud.
Yes.
We know that 40% of frauds are going to be detected by tip. We know that these red flags are going to be the most common. We know that these controls have this effect on finding fraud, on mitigating losses. So it really shows us that even though we're not seeing a lot of new trends, the trends we're seeing are solid. If we saw a lot of variation from year to year, it might be harder for organizations to really understand their risks and to benchmark their own programs. But I think the consistency in the data says this data is really valuable for those things.
Yeah, it allows you to draw conclusions. Yeah, you can feel confident that this data means something.
Exactly. So, or at least that's what the nerd in me thinks.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And something that was highlighted in the letter from the president and CEO from Bruce Dorse this year was kind of the origins of the report, and why it was even created in the first place was to answer these phone calls that Dr. Wells was getting of how much does fraud cost? Give me a number. What does it mean, and what's it doing out there? And so that still stands. This is a way for companies, for individuals to say, this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so what are you guys' takeaways from being able to show that and to illustrate that? And do you still think there is a need? I'm asking you this because I want you to say yes. But how big is that need to illustrate how much this does hurt an organization or cost an organization, and what you can do about it?
I think there absolutely still is a need, because we still get that question
Right,
year-round,
all the
right?
time.
We do this study every 2 years, and so many times in between the studies, we're sending people this report because they're writing in with exactly that question, or they're calling us with exactly that question. How much does fraud cost? How do I show ROI on our anti-fraud initiatives? Right. How do I convince my management that this matters, that this risk is actually a risk? And I think the study absolutely serves that purpose. We can say, take this to them. And this year we tried to make it even easier and say, take this one page to them and show that that this is the risk that you're up against.
It's a real challenge for people in the anti-fraud industry to say, you're at risk. Everybody thinks the guy next door is at risk.
Right. Nobody
thinks they're at risk. And we've gotten better. 20 years ago, you couldn't even have the word fraud in your title at a lot of companies because nobody wanted to admit it was a problem. And that's, when we started doing this, it was because we just couldn't believe that there was no data out there. That, we didn't want to be a research organization like this, but we were getting all these questions like, I can't believe nobody's compiled this. And what Dr. Wells, the sort of germ of the idea was we had access to as good a body of knowledge as existed in the world because we had these thousands of members who what they did was investigate these cases. And so we decided to turn that into something that everyone can use. But that's the idea, right? Is we want organizations, we want people, we want CFEs first and foremost, but really anybody who's in the anti-fraud industry to be able to use this to educate their client, educate their organization about what the risk is, where it lies. It's still a struggle for people to get resources, get spending for anti-fraud programs. And what we hope this does is kind of show that there's a value to that and there's a return on that investment.
One last question that we got via Facebook. Do these fraud trends, and this is a great question. Sorry, I know I cut the question off. Do these fraud trends vary in different regions?
Yes, in some ways.
In some ways.
We actually, if you go to the report itself at the very end, we have great little regional breakdowns, and we'll be releasing additional regional specific information going forward. There are specific areas where the data looks different in different regions. We see some differences in terms of gender, breakdown of perpetrators. Corruption tends to vary based on different reasons, and that's not just our study. Transparency International study shows that
Right,
as well.
right,
So
yeah.
there's different types of fraud risks are more hot spots in different regions than in others. When we look at the globe, it's fascinating to me though, because even with the regional variations, the global data is where we see that consistency.
The consistency, the tips, for instance, which Andy
Right.
talked about. Tips, number one detection method in every region, across the board. Controls.
Right. The top few controls, you'll see variations in the overall implementation rate, but the top few controls tend to be the top few controls in different regions.
The position data,
Right.
depending on how the amounts may vary, and a lot of that in different regions is because outside, in some regions we have fewer cases because we have fewer members in those regions. So you get a little more variance in some of the numbers in
Right.
some of the regions in terms of like a few large cases can maybe skew a median loss a little more. But the overall trends are still pretty consistent, which is, again, interesting. That tells us that fraud's truly a global problem. And the way a fraud happens in Tokyo is not significantly different than the way a fraud happens in New York or
Right.
Dallas or Manitoba. It's a global problem.
Well, wonderful. So I've got to tell you where you can find all of this information to dig in even more. This is a sneak peek of the printed report. And you can visit acfe.com/RTTN to find the PDF you can download, charts and graphs you can download, and the infographics that you can download. And thank you guys so much for
Absolutely.
sitting down to
Absolutely.
talk,
Love to
about,
talk
this.
about this.
And thank you all for tuning in today.